The float dips slightly, sits still, then goes back to normal. You watch it for an hour, and it barely moves the whole time. You reel in to check, and the worm is gone, eaten clean off the hook. The float never told you. It sat there, calm and steady, while a bluegill touched the bait, felt the weight before you saw anything at all, and left without leaving, a clear signal on the surface. This is not a quiet day with no bites. This is a float that is lying to you, and the reason is almost always the same. All the weight on the line is bunched in one spot instead of spread out, which means the fish feels a sudden jolt of resistance the instant it touches the bait, long before the float has any chance to register the take. Old anglers fixed this with a weight system that costs nothing extra and takes 30 seconds to rig. Fix that weight pattern, and the same float that sat dead still all morning starts showing bites you never knew were happening. A float has one job: to show you the exact moment a fish disturbs the bait, with as little delay and as little resistance as possible between the bite and your eyes. For that to work, two things have to be true. First, the float must be balanced precisely, buoyant enough to stay up, but not so buoyant that it resists being pulled under. Second, the weight on the line below the float must be distributed so the fish does not feel it all at once. When either condition fails, the float stops, reporting the bite accurately. It either sits motionless through real bites, or it overreacts to nothing. Most anglers blame the fish for being finicky. The float is the one lying. Here is the most common rig mistake. One single split shot, pinched onto the line a few inches above the hook, carrying the entire weight needed to sink the bait and cock the float. It looks efficient. One piece of weight, easy to adjust, easy to pinch on. But to a fish, that single shot is a hard, concentrated mass sitting right next to the bait. There is no gradual resistance. There is one solid lump of lead a few inches from the hook, and the moment the fish moves the bait even slightly, it moves that lump too, and feels it immediately as a foreign, heavy object attached to its food. When a bluegill picks up a bait rigged this way, the very first thing it feels is not the hook. It is the weight. A single shot, positioned close to the hook, transmits resistance to the fish's mouth the instant it closes around the bait, before the float above has even begun to register the disturbance. The fish, especially a cautious or pressured one, reacts to that resistance in a fraction of a second. It spits the bait. The float, sitting many inches or feet above on the surface, never had time to move. From your seat on the bank, nothing happened. Underwater, a fish grabbed your bait and rejected it almost instantly. This explains the long stretches where the float sits dead still, and you assume nothing is biting. The bites are happening. They are just ending before any signal travels up the line to the float. A single, concentrated weight close to the hook creates an early warning system for the fish, not for you. By the time enough force builds up to move the float, the fish has usually already let go. What you see on the surface is not the absence of fish. It is a rig that resolves the entire bite and reject cycle underwater, invisible to you every single time. There is a second problem that often comes paired with the first. Many anglers, trying to avoid losing weight or wanting the float to sit high, invisible, choose a float with more buoyancy than the weight on the line can properly sink. The result is a float that floats too proudly, riding high, exposing too much of its body above the surface. A fish has to pull against significant buoyant resistance just to make the float twitch. Small, cautious bites barely register at all. Only a hard, committed strike moves a float like this, and most bluegill bites are not hard, committed strikes. They are soft tests. An overbuoyant float erases them completely. Two problems, same outcome. A float that fails to show real bites. 1. Concentrated weight spooks the fish before the float can react. An overbuoyant float resists movement even when the fish does commit. Old anglers fixed both with the same basic correction: split the weight into smaller pieces spread along the line, and balance the float so only the antenna tip shows above the surface. That is the entire fix. Split the weight. Instead of one shot carrying the full load, use 2 or 3 smaller shots spaced out along several inches to a foot above the hook. The total weight stays the same, enough to sink the bait and set the float properly. but no single point on the line carries a sudden, concentrated mass right next to the bait. Each shot is light enough on its own that the fish barely notices it as the bait moves. The resistance is spread out and gradual, instead of immediate and standard practice long before anyone wrote it down as a rule. Placement matters as much as splitting the weight. Put the largest of the small shots highest on the line, several inches to a foot above the hook. Place a medium shot a few inches below that. Place the smallest shot, a small warning shot some old anglers called a telltale shot, just a few inches above the hook itself, light enough that it barely registers to the fish at all. This graduated spacing means the fish encounters almost nothing as it picks up the bait, and any resistance that does exist is so gradual and so light that it does not trigger the instant reject reflex a single heavy shot causes. Balance the float to the antenna. With the weight properly split and attached, add or remove shot until the float sits in the water with only the colored antenna tip showing, not the body, not the base, just the very tip. A float riding with its full body exposed is carrying weight inefficiently and resisting the fish unnecessarily. A float sunk to just the antenna tip is balanced on the edge between floating and sinking, which means the smallest tug from a fish below is enough to pull it under or twitch it visibly. This is the single most important physical adjustment in float fishing, and it is almost never done correctly on a first rig. The telltale shot deserves its own attention. This smallest shot, placed just above the hook, does something specific. It sinks slightly, faster than the float can compensate for in that last few inches, which means even before a fish touches the bait, the float settles into its the final balanced position. Once a fish does take the bait, any movement at all, even pulling the bait 2 inches sideways, is enough to disturb that already fine balance and visibly move the float. Old anglers considered the telltale shot the most important piece of cut weight on the entire rig, despite it being the smallest. Strike timing changes completely with a properly balanced rig. With a single heavy shot and an overbuoyant float, you needed a deep, decisive plunge before there was any chance of a real hookup. And by the time you saw that plunge, the fish was often already gone. With split shot and a float balanced to the antenna, any clear movement is meaningful. A slight lean, a tip that goes from showing to disappearing, a tiny sideways twitch. These are now real signals, not noise. Strike on the first clean movement. The rig is finally sensitive enough to trust. Old anglers built their weight chains by feel, long before anyone sold prepackaged shot assortments. They started with one larger shot near the top of the rig and added smaller shots going down. Testing the float in a bucket of water before ever casting, pinching shot on, watching how high the float sat, adjusting until only the tip showed. This bucket test, done at the kitchen table or on the bank before the first cast, took less time than tying a single knot, and it meant every rig went into the water already correctly balanced instead of being adjusted blind after the fact. When the weight is split and the float is balanced, the entire character of a session changes. Instead of long, uneventful stretches followed by an empty hook, you start seeing the float lean, twitch, and dip on bites you would have completely missed before. The fish are not behaving any to runs differently. The same bluegill, the same caution, the same soft test of the bait, but now that test is visible because nothing on the rig warns the fish away and nothing on the float resists showing you what is happening below. Same dock, same bait, same fish. A completely different picture on the surface. The checklist before the float goes in. Weight split into 2 or 3. Shots instead of 1. Spaced along several inches to a foot above the hook. Smallest shot closest to the bait. Float. Balanced so only the antenna tip shows above the surface, not the body. Strike. On any clean movement, not just a deep plunge. Before you cast, test the balance in calm water near the bank. Add or remove shot until the float settles correctly. A float that tells the truth is not an accident. It is a rig built the way old anglers built every rig, piece by piece, checked before it ever touched the water. Subscribe to Traditional Angling for more field-based fishing knowledge.